You're listening to a podcast of spurious morality.
Hello and welcome to a podcast of spurious morality. I'm Johnstone and I'm joined by Jimmy.
Hello.
And Greg.
Hello.
And we're all back in the room, which means that we must be doing a season by season. And if I've done my maths correctly, it's season 9 that we are up to. We're well into the Pertwee era now, and it's already, as we discussed last time, sort of something very different to how it started off. Season 7 was pretty unique. Season 8 had a few hangovers from Season 7, but I think Season 9 is perhaps the first proper out-and-out Dixon-let series, it's fair to say, maybe. It's absolutely their show now. There's no hint or anything like that left of what was there before. So I will start off, as ever, asking you guys which story is your favourite. So do you want to go first, Jimmy?
Yeah, I think for me, it's got to be The Curse of Peladon. I think I just love the off-Earth stories and the historicals, and most of the Pertwee era is present day, so it's always good to get a bit of variety from that. And I think the first Peladon story is just such a good one.
Yeah, it's a fantastic serial, and it was sort of quite topical at the time it came out as well. And I particularly like the fact that it kind of, the Ice Warriors aren't bad guys. It kind of, up until this point, every Ice Warrior we've met has been a baddie, and actually, they're a race where no, they're not necessarily all villains. So it's good to sort of get a good Ice Warrior. What about you, Greg? What's your favourite?
It's also The Curse of Peladon for me. The Sea Devils is a close second, but I think ultimately it's just a bit too long. We'll talk about that later. But Curse of Peladon is just a smart and tight script and has some good performances. And I think it's pretty clearly the best of this run.
Well, it's 3 for 3. I absolutely agree. I think Curse is the best from this run. However, I'm one of the very few people in the world that prefers Monster of Peladon to Curse, but I guess that's a discussion for season 11 when we get there. But yeah, Curse, very, very good story. There's an awful lot to enjoy, and we will discuss it a little bit more shortly. But first of all, we'll go to Day of the Daleks, which was it's quite a good Dalek story. I think it's sort of nice. It's a nice, solid Dalek story. However, it's not the sort of grand return after 4-5 years off screen that it could have been. I think it's another Dalek story. They're like, let's bring the Daleks back. And they don't really do anything exceptional with that. They could have had any villain in that role, I think. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Jimmy, what are your thoughts on Day of the Daleks?
Well, I have to say, I watched the special edition version because those Dalek voices in the default are pretty terrible. It's shocking how they forgot to control the machines or whatever, and you just get these bland voices like this. It's terrible. I couldn't even watch it. I had to watch the special edition. But like you say, it's not really a great return for the Daleks. It's very much an average story. I think the other weird thing is that the Earth's been invaded by Daleks 200 years in the future, and of course we've already had that with the Dalek invasion of Earth. And so you get to the end of this story, and it's like, oh, we've prevented the Daleks conquering Earth in 200 years. And it's like, well, actually, you haven't. They've just invaded it differently. So it kind of makes the story fall apart a bit if you know the history. But yeah, I think the special edition helps. I think it's a pretty good story overall, but yeah, lots of little weird things. For example, I love at the start that scene where the Doctor and Joe pop up from the future, and you see them, and it's just the lab has a conveniently yellow CSO wall behind them for them to appear on, and it's just looks weird. And then you've got the Doctor's lab. When you pan over later, he's got a weapons testing range in the middle of his lab, and it just doesn't seem like a really doctory thing. I mean, he's supposed to be working on TARDIS, trying to get it working again, and oh yeah, I've got a bit of spare time for some weapons testing right in the same room. It's it's a bit weird, and I noticed with the special edition as well. I thought originally it might have been a fault with it. At the start of episode 2 and 3, at the end of where the cliffhanger was, you can hear the theme music start again in the background, and I thought, is this a fault they've accidentally introduced with the special edition? So I went back to the DVD, and no, it's on the DVD special edition. So I went back to the original, and no, it's on the original version. And it's just something I've never seen mentioned before, but it's really glaringly obvious to me, and it's sort of it shows a bit of shoddy workmanship. So it's a bit of a pity, but yeah, most of the story's good. The other thing being the Ogrons are a bit. I mean, they weren't handled very well. And I mean, with it being tied into the Dalek invasion of Earth time, they could have even brought back the Robomen, but of course that wouldn't look as good in the days after the Cybermen had been introduced, but it would have been a nice continuity thing. But yeah, the story's all right despite that, but just it's not as brilliant as it should have been for a return of the Daleks after such a long time.
I think, yeah, that sort of cliffhanger sting at the end of the reprise it's interesting. I can only assume it was like a deliberate decision, but it's a bit of a strange one, really. Greg, what about you? What do you think of Day of the Daleks?
Well, I mean, just to start, Jimmy was just saying that the Doctor having a weapons testing range seems a little undoctorish for him. I'll tell you what seems really undoctorish for him is when in the middle of the story he picks up a gun and shoots an Ogron. Like, what? I mean, it really, that moment really doesn't feel that out of character for Pertwee or in the context of the show as we've watched it. Like, the Doctor's never been one to shy away from violence when necessary up till this point, but especially if you're, a longtime viewer of the revived series and the man who never would and all of that, then to just see him just casually gun down a random Ogron is like, what? So that moment's interesting. I like this story as a concept. As a Dalek story, I think it's pretty terrible because the Daleks don't do anything for 3 episodes, and then they kind of half-heartedly try to storm the mansion, and it's very obvious they only have 3 of them or whatever, and it just doesn't look threatening at all. I mean, it's somewhat interesting to see Unit fight the Daleks, but it's just so half-hearted, and it just really doesn't come off. But the concept of the story is really good. Doctor Who has not to this point really done too many episodes that play around with the concept of time travel, and this one does. It's also a story that really embraces like Unit's role as an international organization, and it portrays an Earth that is on the brink of nuclear conflict, and it actually makes that feel a little bit convincing in ways that as much as I love the Mind of Evil, that international situation seemed a little more James Bondy, whereas this one seems much more realistic, if such a thing is possible. So I liked that, and I love the grandfather paradox. You did it yourselves, like that. That's an all time great moment in the Pertwee era for sure. But yeah, I mean, why is it Day of the Daleks? I don't know. Like I said, they don't do anything for 3 episodes. Like, it's much more interesting to see the society that's grown up around them than to see the Daleks themselves. So there's a lot to enjoy here, but it's kind of rickety and oh yeah, Jimmy also mentioned the scene at the beginning with the Doctor and Joe meeting their future selves, and that's great. But then, I mean, weren't they supposed to then be on the other side of that at the end of the story? Like, isn't that how that's supposed to work? But Yeah, it's not there. So
I think they did. I can't remember whether it was scripted or recorded, but there was definitely supposed to be the sort of the punchline to that scene at the start. But it is an odd little scene, and actually, we had something very similar in Ambassadors of Death with the Doctor and Liz sort of flicking a few seconds into the future here and there. So I guess it's a callback to that, something similar to that. But yeah, it's quite strange that there's no punchline. And actually, as a story, it does end very, very abruptly. Um, the Daleks get blown up, and then the Doctor tells all the humans to be good, and that's it. End of story. So I wonder if there was an overrunning issue or something like that, because it is even by classic Doctor Who standards, it's a very, very abrupt ending. It's definitely an interesting story. I think it works well because it's a Dalek story that does something slightly different. I think the fact that Terry Nation didn't write it probably helps. Yeah, I do like a Terry Nation story, but this is sort of a rare early classic series look at what can be done with the Daleks without him. Of course, we've had a couple of David Whittaker stories as well in the second Doctor era, but yeah, it's a curious one. What I also think is curious is the fact that when they did decide they were bringing back the Daleks to Doctor Who after such a long time, they kind of they did. They got the bloke that wrote Planet of Giants to do it. It's, of all writers that have ever written Doctor Who before, which one should we go for? The one that wrote a story so boring they had to get rid of an episode before it was broadcast. Bit strange. But yeah, it's an enjoyable story. I do think the special edition works wonders. I really do think that it's the definitive version of the story as far as I'm concerned now. And I have to admit that I thought it was a bit of an odd choice to get the special edition treatment when it was first announced for the DVD way back when. But actually, when I first watched it, I completely understood why they'd chosen to do it. And it was sort of done with love, and it does correct a few of the things that we've sort of suggested are a bit of a problem, like the fact that they only had 3 Daleks originally, but this one kind of gives us more and that sort of thing. So we'll move on. We'll move on to the story that we have all agreed is the best in season 9, and that is Curse of Peladon. It's always sort of stuck out to me as a bit odd how at the start of this story, the Doctor and Jo are just in the TARDIS casually on a trip, like that's what they do every week, even though at this stage the Doctor is still stranded on Earth. It very much sort of sets out something that we see again in this series, in that, yeah, we're going to do alien planets again now. We're not going to make a big song and dance about the Doctor being trapped on Earth. It's a great story though. It's another, obviously the Doctor has been forced by the Time Lords to do this, or manipulated by the Time Lords into fulfilling the role that he does. But it's a lot of fun. I think it is a fun story as well. And Peladon is such a really well established planet. There's some excellent world building. It's definitely one of the best developed planets and societies in classic Doctor Who. So Jimmy, your thoughts on the Curse of Peladon?
Yeah, as we all said, it's the best story of the season, but I think there's definitely lots of tiny little niggles that tiny flaws with it that I've found, but I love it despite them. It's such a brilliant dynamic. It's a great, interesting planet, and they set it up really well. And the Doctor and Jo's dynamic is pretty much at its best. But there's lots of weird little things like uh, one thing is the sort of the way it handles the dynamic of the joining the Federation thing. There's some sort of odd things there, like for instance, Ice Warriors being there and them actually being the good guys was a great fake out. I loved that, but it does kind of make the Doctor look a little racist. It's like, it's the Ice Warriors. They're definitely the bad ones. And I mean, you can see why you'd see that watching the show, like, as a fan, but it just comes across a bit badly. And there's a few other little things like that, like Peladon, King Peladon. they mention about his earth blood giving him civilization and taking him out of the primitivism, and it's a bit dodgy, but it's the story works despite that, but that's another thing. Like the alien delegates, the Martian delegates get names, which they had them back in the Troughton era too. But then you've got Arcturus and Alpha Centauri who are just called by their planet's name, and it just so underdeveloped. It's like I think the story would have worked a lot better if they developed the different Federation races. Like they did a great job of the Ice Warriors and the Peladonians, but Arcturus and Alpha Centauri are kind of badly handled there. But and then later on, the pit fight is so drawn out; it's a bit over the top. But despite all these faults and other little things like the strings holding Alpha's lower arms up as he lifts his higher ones. But there's lots of good stuff to enjoy, and definitely the dynamic between the Doctor and Joe and Peladon. Some of the highlights, like I love Joe just jumping into being considered a princess and casually insulting her pilot's bad landing and all that. And the other nice little touch is Joe and Peladon's relationship and the way things could have easily gone differently got handled so well. And I think the highlight of that for me is the final scene when Joe tells Peladon that she's not really a princess, but as soon as the third Doctor walks in the room to leave, Peladon tells her goodbye, Your Highness. And I just love that he's like, maybe he doesn't, he assumes the Doctor doesn't even know she's not a real princess, and even though she's rejected him, he still tries to cover for her there. And I just thought that was a sweet little moment, and quite nice. So it's a great story overall, but as I say, lots of faults, but the story overcomes them all. The story manages to be thoroughly enjoyable despite all these little issues with it.
Yeah, I suppose that sort of looking back on it now, 50 years later, I do think that obviously just sort of there's a bit there that's a bit sketchy and wouldn't happen today. Yes, I agree with that. But it does have its faults, it does have its problems, but it's still a thoroughly enjoyable story. Greg, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, as I said, I think it's the best story of the season. What I like about it is you saw this with Brian Hales writing the two Troughton Ice Warrior stories, where the characters had some distinct motivations that weren't completely black and white, and that's definitely brought back here. Certainly, Arcturus is something close to a villain, but even like Hepesh, for example, is is driven by an understandable, not acceptable, but an understandable motivation. He's not a cackling megalomaniac. He's trying to preserve the traditions of his society, and he's trying to you know to use the old conservative phrase, stand before history yelling stop kind of thing. But and setting him against Peladon, who is quite well portrayed as a young, more progressive idealist king who really sees the benefits of opening his planet up to the rest of the galaxy. It's a more interesting conflict than we often get, because normally we'd have just one person being super noble and heroic and the other one being just outright evil. Whereas here, Peladon, for example, like his relationship with Joe, he's able to completely disassociate his political responsibilities from his personal responsibilities, and so he doesn't even grasp really why Joe wouldn't understand how he could sentence the Doctor to death and then propose marriage to her. And I like those little notes. I like that they set up the Ice Warriors, to be bad guys and then reveal that they're not. I mean, from a modern perspective, having had so many Ice Warrior stories, at this point, whenever there's an Ice Warrior story, one of the mysteries is, are they going to be good or bad in this one? But this is the story that started that, and it really works well. And then it's inverted again when Monster of Peladon comes around. And yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting society that they portray. It kind of continues with Day of the Daleks, where it's showing politics being difficult and messy and dangerous. And for all those reasons, I like it a lot. I also think it's easily the best story for Katie Manning since she joined the program. I think her performance in this is really good. And yeah, it's a really good story.
You could argue, I suppose, that this is the first time Joe gets some really good material. It's definitely a Joe story, and there are a few other Joe stories as we go on, but this is perhaps the first one where she's not just the ask questions, hold test tubes, and make coffee kind of companion that she's described as in within the first couple of minutes of her appearing in season 8. It's the only real fault with this story for me is as Jimmy mentioned before, the pit fight. It goes on for way too long. It's as paddy as Doctor Who ever gets. It's ridiculous. It genuinely feels longer and more drawn out than sort of Planet of the Spiders Part 6, relying on a very, very, very long cliffhanger reprise. Is something like 6-7 minutes, isn't it? So yeah, it's the only thing that lets the story down is they were obviously running out of material at the end of Part 3. But it's a minor quibble, Doctor Who. There are many, many long, drawn-out sequences that outstay the welcome, and it's unfair to single this one out, I think. Okay, we shall move on. And next up is The Sea Devils, where we get a nice sort of look at where the Master ended up after the demons, and I quite like the whole first episode, visiting the Master in prison, that kind of thing. It's sort of really well done, and he's going out of his way to make it look like he is locked up and he is a prisoner, and of course he's got the entire prison under his control, effectively. It's a sequel to the Silurians. I think it tries to sort of make the same moral points, offer the same moral debate that the Silurians did, but I don't think the Sea Devils does it as effectively. I think it's more interested in sort of, oh, look, monsters, which is something that this era Doctor Who does quite a bit. So, Jimmy, what are your thoughts on the Sea Devils?
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed the story, but it's definitely not one of the best. It's got a few faults, but the best thing, as always, with his stories, Delgado, he is absolutely brilliant in this, and he always raises up the quality of any story he's in, pretty much. So that was definitely a highlight. One thing I've noted down, one of my first dot points I wrote when I was watching the story is that the music is absolutely appalling. And I mean, it's the Pertwee era, so you get bad music quite a bit, but this is the worst, I think, in his era that it gets. And it's irritating. It really drags down an otherwise great story. But yeah, it's enjoyable. And it's certainly the dynamic with the Sea Devils is I think it's well handled. It's not better than the Silurians, or probably arguably not as good, but it manages quite well. It still manages to get the same sort of points across, I find. Other weird things I've noticed were like at the start when the Doctor just casually goes from the prison straight to the naval base and just sort of dumps Joe behind him with no goodbye, no see you later, no whatever. He just sort of buggers off and leaves her in the lurch, and it just seemed a bit weird. Like maybe in the early days it would have made more sense that he do that, but they've sort of built up their Doctor companion dynamic. They're really close these days, and yet he suddenly just abandons her for no reason. It just seemed a bit weird. And the other weird thing with the island was what was with all those doorless cars. They looked so stupid. It was like, we haven't got enough budget. We'll just buy half a car and reuse all these half cars that are missing their doors. It just looks so silly. But it still manages to be a good story. I love the sword fight between the Doctor and the Master, and the jokes like the taking the plate of sandwiches or whatever and taking a pause to eat, and the sword's just being conveniently there, which doesn't make much sense, but hey, it leads to a great scene, so it's pretty good. And the other thing is that that I noticed was that point where the doctor's tied to the chair and Joe's outside talking to him through the window, and all I could think of was the Ten and Donna, their famous conversation through a window scene, and it works out a bit better for Joe because they actually don't get caught, but just a funny little parallel I thought of. And yeah, back to food again with the sword fight. The other thing is, and it follows up to Day of the Daleks earlier in the season. It it just seems like a qualification of unit is to be a bit of a dick about food, because first, back in Day of the Daleks, you have Yates stealing the food that Joe was about to give Benton, and then here you have the Doctor just taking that plate of sandwiches from Joe and giving it to literally everyone else and leaving her with none. It's almost like there's this arc of every unit member's got to be a bit of a dick when it comes to sharing their food. It's just a weird thing that they seem to make a recurring sort of point to do of. But yeah, the other thing is that minefield scene. I love how the Doctor just collapses over the barbed wire and let Joe run all over him. It's just, there's got to have been a better way to get across than that, but it's just sweet that he puts himself in all the danger and just lets her literally walk all over him. Yeah, it's a great story, great fun. But yeah, as I say, lots of weird little things that make you think, what were they doing?
Yeah, it's one of those stories that does have some absolutely brilliant little moments. The sandwiches and that kind of thing, and I think it is something that sort of gives it quite a lot of charm. And the Doctor is a bit cheeky in this one. Does have a bit of a sense of humour, which is something that kind of comes and goes with Pertwee's Doctor. Sometimes he's sort of very witty, and other times he's very serious, but it doesn't seem to be in any particular context. Just one story he's written one way, another he's written another. But I think this one is kind of the third Doctor at his most third Doctorish, perhaps. I kind of wish they'd have played a little more into the sequel to the Silurians thing, about how the Doctor will see what happened at the end of Silurians as a failure, and that kind of. It doesn't quite get touched on in the way it could have done, but there was definitely potential for some great character stuff there that I do think Sea Devils misses. Greg, what do you think of it?
It's a close second for me. In season 9 is the best story of the year. It definitely has some flaws. It's too long, for one thing. It really does not need to be 6 episodes long. There are a lot of instances of obvious padding, which is something we're going to come back to in all 3 of the 6-parters of this season. But it's definitely dragged out. But there's a lot about it that works. I think bringing the Navy in as the military attaché for this is very effective because it allows them to use all these different Navy ships, and there's a hovercraft and all this stuff, and they really get to show off what would be an unrealistically high budget for the show with all this stuff. So that's cool. It's also nice to have the Doctor paired up with an organization that isn't so ready to accept what he says. He's not part of the system in this one. He's kind of this, crazy mad scientist outsider who's coming in and talking about, evil masterminds and so on. Though that being said, it's a little weird that the people at the naval base aren't more familiar with the master, given that he's the only prisoner in the prison and he's an international criminal, and everyone apparently wanted him executed. And the Navy commander and the prison warden go golfing together. Like, why wasn't there more conversation about this? And then another thing that I think is kind of funny is at the very start of the story, when the Doctor and Joe are on the boat going out to the prison, like, it is filmed as though they are out in the middle of nowhere, like they are at sea. They're going to this remote prison, and then you find out that, well, okay, it's not that remote because there's also a Navy base on the island. Oh, okay. And actually, there's also a town. And then you see like shots of the water, and there's like 5,000 boats in the water, and it's not remote at all. And like the whole island thing just doesn't really come off after that. So they really don't nail the isolation thing very well. Um, the other thing is like you were saying, they're really trying to recreate the Sea Devil, or sorry, the Silurians here. It's the same type of conflict. The Sea Devils have the same story as the Silurians. The Doctor is advocating for peace, and it just really seems perfunctory. Like you said, it's more about the monsters and the action sequences and looking cool, because it really does. The Doctor's portrayal in this is not very flattering, honestly. He's he's so gung ho about forming a peace between humanity and the Sea Devils when no one seems that interested in it. I mean, there is no like hesitation among the humans. I can't remember the name of the civil servant who comes in to take over near the end, which is a fantastic performance, by the way. Like him just like dismissively like eating breakfast after ordering, a nuclear war is is a more unsympathetic portrayal than we've had with some of these politician characters before. But overall, like the moral, conflict here, the humans just immediately attack the Sea Devils. The Doctor like talks the Sea Devil leader into negotiating, but then that immediately falls apart. And then the Doctor's like, "But we should all be at peace," and it's like very clearly not going to happen, and it just makes him seem kind of ineffectual. And I don't think that works very well. Um, I'm really like complaining a lot here for a story that I like. But no, I mean the Sea Devils are kind of they look better than they should. Really, I think they work pretty well. I think the action sequences are really good. I think Pertwee's really good in this. I think you're finally starting to see like some real affection between the Doctor and Jo. So when he does like pick on her a little bit, it feels more like affectionate rather than just the Doctor being an ass. So I think that works really well. I'm happy to see that's developing, and the Master is absolutely fantastic. Like his Delgado and Pertwee in this together are great. Like it's a really fun story to watch. It's just it's too long, and it really mishandles the moral conflict that it's trying to present.
Yeah, it's not as well done as the Silurians was, and it feels longer than the Silurians as well, which is weird, obviously, because Silurians is an episode longer. Um, but yeah, it seems like a very simplified, bare bones version. But it like you say, it is a very good story. I'd have it as second on my list after Curse for this season as well. There's just it does go on too long. I remember when I very, very first saw it, and it got to the episode 5 cliffhanger, and I could have sworn that it was episode 6. I was really surprised there was a cliffhanger because it had been going on for so long. I'd watched so much story. Surely this had to be the end. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. It does do action incredibly well. They really did. They were really lucky with cooperation of the Navy. It's an action by Havoc story, and they sort of enhance it a great deal as well. Yeah, it's a really good bit of Doctor Who, and it's quite rightly the Sea Devils are remembered as one of the great monsters. We'll move on to The Mutants, a story that in some ways it's really clever, in other ways it's really, really stupid. I find it interesting. I find it curious. I don't think it's as bad as its reputation suggests. But if Sea Devils felt slow, this is positively glacial. So little happens for so much of the story, but it does have really interesting villains. It does have an interesting sort of moral debate. There are some excellent performances in it, some really good performances in it. And I think there's an awful lot there to like. I think it's just dragged down by the 6-episode runtime. And honestly, in this season, they'd have been better off making an extra 4-parter instead of having 6-parters. They should have just gone for 6 serials, keep the Time Monster at 6 parts because it just about justifies it. But yeah, Mutants just goes on for way too long. So, Jimmy, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely, as you say, a bit longer than it should be. But I think it's a good story despite that. The whole, lots of great concepts, like the way the planet works, and it's got 500-year seasons, and they evolve to change each way through the season. It's, yeah, I like the concept, but yeah, it really drags out. It really goes very slowly. And also at the start, it's again just like before the previous story. The Doctor wants to just go off to the planet without Joe, and it's odd at this stage. Like when she'd first joined him in like season 8, it sort of made sense when he was a bit distant. But by this point, he shouldn't be telling her, "Oh no, I'll go by myself." Like it just feels weird that he doesn't trust her more. It's, yeah, very odd moment. But I do like sorry. I do like their dynamic across the rest of the story. Like, I love that little conversation about Earth in this time is just all grey and technology's ruined it and technology's gone too far, sort of thing. It's sort of a bit of a weird message to have, but you can see why it's, especially in the 70s and the way things were going then, that you can see why they'd say that. But it's, yeah, the Doctor plays it well. The other weird things were like the hand palm controls to open the doors, just sort of taking anyone's hand. Like they let mutants in, they let Solonians in, they let the Overlords humans in. It just seemed weird that they even bothered with having the palm reader there if it was just going to open for any palm. Except then in the final episode, there's suddenly a lock that you can put on it, and it's just like, why didn't they have that sooner? And then you've got Stubbs and Cotton that they have a great dynamic across the story, but when they've just realised that they're caught and the marshal could be onto them, and they're walking to this interview with him where he's going to confront them about it, and they ask each other if, oh, is the marshal onto us? And they're standing about one step away from the marshal's guard. It's so ridiculous. Like, oh, does the marshal know we're betraying him? Oh, hi, guard. It was just such a silly moment. But yeah, other than that, yeah, brilliant story. Oh, and the when the colony ship up in space blows its side, the depressurization is so badly realized. Like, it's first they're all holding on, and yeah, it makes sense, but then they sort of let go and walk out a bit. It's just a bit too. I don't know. Like, I don't think they could have realized it better at that time, but maybe they should have done it a bit differently. I don't know how, but yeah, it definitely wasn't handled well. And then you go back to the evolution thing and how they change into mutants and that. I think they sort of missed a trick in not sort of showing what other forms they could have had and showing how they work differently. And then it's suddenly weird that, like, okay, if they're adapting to survive the different climates or whatever, then yeah, maybe these mutants make sense to survive in the hotter weather. But then Kai becomes the glowing rainbow angel avatar of gay pride at the end and can just fly through walls and zap people to death and do anything. And it's like, okay, so that was the next season after. So that's how you cope with. So that's how you cope with autumn, is it? What about the autumns of this planet made you into a superhero? So yeah, it's a bit weirdly handled there, but it's still good. I mean, the story, you manage to enjoy it despite all these things. Like, it's obvious rewatching it, and you pick up on every little fault, but I think the story was enjoyable enough that despite its overlong length and padding, I think it was still a good story overall.
Yeah, it seems to be the one from this season that really gets singled out as being full of padding, but actually, Curse of Peladon has the pit fight that goes on forever. The Sea Devils is padded out left, right, and centre. It's a really unfair reputation. It's guilty of it, certainly, but so's everything around it. We're going to go into the Time Monster in a minute, which has an entire episode of the Doctor and the Master bickering like children through TARDIS screens. It's padding at its most ridiculous. So yeah, the Mutants doesn't do anything that the other stories don't do in terms of padding. It's a bit of an odd one. in terms of you mentioned the sort of depressurization sequence, it's another example of Bob Baker and Dave Martin writing something that's just completely unachievable by the production team. They did it. They did a fair bit of it in Claws of Axos. They've done it in this. Three Doctors as well. I think it works well, but it's very ambitious. It's an ambitious script, an entire building being sucked into a black hole, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's something I think that the writers are definitely guilty of doing, and it just seems a bit daft that nobody turned round to them at all and went, "We can't really do this, guys. Can you try and do it another way?" They just kind of pushed ahead with what was written. It's a bit strange. Greg, what are your thoughts on the mutants?
Well, that's really the Bob Baker, Dave Martin thing, is coming up with ridiculous concepts that are just not doable on a BBC budget, and then Doctor Who pushing ahead and trying to do them anyway. But I think what sets this one apart from their other scripts is how overtly political it is, and how nuanced a lot of the characterization is. Like, it's a smart and more subtle story than I think it gets credit for. It has this reputation as being just this horrendous episode of Doctor Who, and I hadn't watched it in a long time, precisely because I kind of had a vague recollection of it not being very good, but I enjoyed watching it this time. I was actually surprised by it. I mean, I will not deny that it is very heavily padded. There's no question about that. But even though, you've got, a character in the Marshal who's certainly more of the black and white villain type, again, this is someone, at least you've seen this sort of archetype in characters before. The tin pot dictator, the guy that's been nominally in charge for some time, and all of a sudden he's going to have that power taken away from him. And even though I'm sure he's made a lot of money or whatever they do in this time period, he could very easily retire based on his career as the leader, or as the head of security or whatever it is. He doesn't want to do that, and he desperately clings to power, and it's a really interesting portrayal in that regard. But at the same time, like, the Solonians, I mean, they're not portrayed as entirely blameless and noble and so on. I mean, right at the near the beginning of the story, they start a demonstration during the speech to them, and without even realizing that the speech is going to grant them their freedom, and that the overseers are going to leave, because they listen to the intro to the speech, which by necessity has to be this self-aggrandizing thing for the overseers about how they brought civilization to this planet, and they modernized it and so on. And so the natives at that point hear that, and they're like, "Oh God, here we go again! Like, what nonsense are they about to pull?" And so they disrupt the thing, and then there's the assassination and so on, and you realize that, like, if that hadn't happened, the story would have just been over. The overseers would have just left. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. And I like things like that. I like where there's a little more subtlety in the portrayals, and that carries through the story. And I think they really seed the idea of, like, the evolution of the Solonians through the story is really well done. It's different points of that revelation come at different points of the story. It moves along pretty well. It's just, again, like, I am really looking forward to the point at which they finally realize that 4 parts is the ideal length for a Doctor Who story, because this is just dragged out a lot. It's dragged out even more than the Sea Devils, but it's not dragged out as much as the next story. But we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, The 6-part thing at this stage just isn't working. It did work when there were 2, 3 companions in the TARDIS, and they could all go off and have their own separate little adventures, and one of them could even go on holiday and not be in the story for 2 weeks. But the way that Doctor Who's production has changed by this stage doesn't match up to the way they're still producing serials, the way they're serializing and distributing these episodes. And it's, we don't get rid of 6-parters altogether until season 18. We're still quite a long way off that. But what we're getting here is genuinely showing that the 6-part thing just doesn't work as a regular thing. I think if someone comes up with a story that can justify 6-part, almost 3-hour runtime, then fine, let's do it. It should happen. But this is just filling 6 episodes in the schedule for the sake of it in any way possible, which perfectly leads me on to the Time Monster. I don't know what's going on with this story. It's full of weird, amazing, out there, ridiculous ideas. It kind of has the Master at his strangest. It contradicts something that the same writer wrote into The Demons just one series earlier, and it's bonkers. It's padded. It's bonkers. It's Doctor Who at its most mad. It always does feel sort of like a standout story for all the wrong reasons. It's still somewhat enjoyable. It's still quite captivating, but it's Doctor Who at its oddest. It really is. Jimmy, what are your thoughts on the Time Monster?
I actually think that, yes, it's one of the poorer Pertwee stories, but on this rewatch, it had been so long since I'd last seen it, and I remembered it being really terrible. I set my expectations really low, and I actually ended up enjoying it a lot more than I remembered from past viewings. It's very flawed. It's one of the poorer Pertwee stories, but I think it's got lots of good stuff to recommend it. And again, well, like we've said with a lot of Pertwee stories, there's some cool stuff badly executed, like or at least not as well executed as it could have been, like the idea of doing a story that's actually set in Atlantis and in its heyday, and or the idea of having the TARDISes inside each other, and I think the problem with it is they spend a bit too long on the sort of sci-fi. Oh, we're building a machine that teleports things, and they sort of spent 3 whole episodes on that before they got to the Atlantis stuff or the TARDIS stuff. And I think it's not so much that it doesn't justify 6 episodes, it's just that they should have divided it differently. Do 1 or 2 episodes on that, expand the TARDIS stuff and write it a bit better, and expand the Atlantis stuff and handle it a bit differently. But yeah, I think it's overall not as bad as most people would say. There's, again, lots of little flaws and faults, like the radiation suit, where you've got to put on this big bulky radiation suit and the hat, and you're walking with no gloves and wide open sleeves. I mean, I'm not sure how you think that's going to protect you. But yeah, lots of good stuff. Like, I liked the Brigadier's expression at the start when the Doctor's like, "I've seen the Master." "Oh, where?" "In a dream." And the Brigadier's just like rolling his eyes like, "What the hell do I have to deal with now?" Or again, for the Brigadier later, what was it? When the Master does the Brigadier's voice and Benton sees through it, so like the Brigadier doesn't call us "my dear fellow," and no, that's the oldest trick in the book. They do some clever stuff there, and again, the other thing, like I said earlier, the TARDIS is inside each other. The thing that made that not work for me wasn't so much how drawn out it was as the flaw that, okay, the Doctor's TARDIS is now inside the Master's TARDIS, and the Master's TARDIS is inside the Doctor's TARDIS, but at the same time, the Master's TARDIS is still in the lab. Like, isn't it supposed to be inside the Doctor's TARDIS? And so, yeah, I think they could have done a bit better with that and handled it a bit better. But again, lots of other good stuff, like when the Brigadier at the end cliffhanger at the end of, is it episode 3 or 4? I can't remember, but when the Brigadier thinks Mike Yates has been killed, and when he stops going Mike, and when he stops going Yates, and he's like Mike, and it's like seeing the Brigadier actually, care about his soldiers as men, and yeah, I think they did a good job there. And for me, the Atlantis stuff actually, I seem to remember it being really terrible, but it wasn't as bad as I thought. I mean, it's an interesting society they've got there, an interesting sort of setting. The whole palace coup thing with the master manipulating the queen and basically wooing her and acting like he's in love with her, and her believing it and getting betrayed. And I think the Atlantis stuff was actually really well handled, and I loved the Doctor's Daisiest Daisy speech. Of course, that's always one of the fascinating things of the show. And I love at the end the master being so desperate, begging for his freedom, and it's the way Delgado plays it. Like, he plays really very hammerly, very like not like him. Usually he plays things very well, but it's almost like he's taking the piss, and like he knows the Doctor's going to rescue him, and so he's just, oh Doctor, poor me, sort of thing. I think it actually works really well, and it contrasts nicely with how he's usually so much more dark and suave, and just the way he drops all that to beg for his freedom works pretty good. Um, yeah, overall, I really actually thoroughly enjoyed the story, more than I expected and more than I remembered. It's still one of the poorer Pertwees, but it's not all that bad actually.
Yeah, it's certainly not my least favourite story of the era, but it's odd. I said that before. I'm sticking to it. It's a very odd story. It's very out there. It does actually have some lovely little moments. So you're right about the Brigadier sort of dropping the military professional demeanour and going Mike, Mike. I'd never really cottoned onto that before, but yeah, that's a great little moment, and it sort of really hammers home the concept of the unit family. And this is, of course, the last story to feature all of them. It's the last story to have the Dr. Joe, the Brig, Mike, Benton, and the Master. And it's a bit of a shame that, like, as a concept, the unit family goes out with a bit of a whimper. It's, we see Mike injured, Benton spends half the story as a baby, the Brigadier doesn't do particularly much, and the Doctor and Joe chase the Master off to Atlantis. It's a good way of, I guess, of making a six-parter not feel as overly long as it could. A location switch. It's done very successfully a few times. It's certainly done quite successfully a few times in the Tom Baker era. But it does still feel slow. It does still feel padded, and that fourth episode, it sort of walks a tightrope between really, really over the top padding and just being so genius about how blasé the whole thing is. The Doctor and the Master just bickering from their TARDISes. Also, the TARDIS, it looks weird. I don't like the washing up bowl interior that thankfully we only see in this story. I just don't think it works. I think it looks like it was designed in a hurry. And the TARDIS that we'd had up until this stage has looked so much better. Greg, what are your thoughts on the Time Monster?
I reserve the right to change my mind over the next 2 seasons, but this is probably going to end up being my least favorite story of the Pertwee era. I actually had kind of the opposite reaction as Jimmy. Like, I kind of remembered, this is another one I hadn't watched in a long time, and I kind of remembered having like a good time with it. And this time I was watching it and was just so bored. Oh my goodness, is it slow? It's probably the most obviously padded Doctor Who story to this point. I mean, obviously, we've had longer stories that have had a lot of padding in them, so it's hard to objectively measure it, but this one really feels padded out. What I like about it is, like you guys were saying, very bonkers out there ideas, which is always a good feature of Doctor Who for me. The the stuff with Kronos and the Chronivore in and of itself isn't all that interesting, but tying it to not only ancient Greece but Atlantis is a really fun idea. So that's exciting. I mean, like you said, we've got the whole unit family together, and you can at the very least tell that the cast is really enjoying themselves making this story. But it feels like they're all in on the joke and we're not. Like there's a lot of winking and nodding in this, and just Jimmy mentioned the Daisiest Daisy scene, for example. That's when we're talking about padding. Like that's a great little moment. Like that's a really like you pull that out. That's a really like little definitional moment for the Third Doctor. But it's very obviously there just to fill time. Like it has basically nothing to do thematically with the story around it. Like it's just thrown in there because they need to fill out the episode, and so the Doctor and Joe need to just have a conversation. And so again, like it doesn't mean that every moment of padding is inherently bad, because again, this one's a very nice little character moment for the Doctor. But like it's the only it's a story where so much of the padding is just screamingly obvious. Like so many scenes where characters just sit down and have pointless conversations with each other. Even like when it shifts to Atlantis, like it's even there, like right from the get go, it just feels drawn out. The whole bit with the Minotaur, like that doesn't need to be like I don't I'm almost speechless by how little of this story even remotely needs to be in it. I mean, as crazy as it sounds, like this could be a two-parter. Like, why it's six? Like, what are you doing? Like, just please stop with these endless, interminable six-parters. I don't know. I don't like it.
I think that it is fair enough. Yeah, it's. I think there is a good story in there. There are a lot of good ideas in there. I would say that they kind of throw everything but the kitchen sink at this one, but they literally throw the kitchen sink at it as well. It's on the TARDIS walls. It's just so weird. It's like, you mentioned the Minotaur, and it's like, yeah, there's a Minotaur here as well, by the way. That's going to fill up a few minutes of story, and then, oh, there's this other thing too. And it doesn't have any kind of real focus. It's the location shifts, the characters shift. It's just it's odd. The whole thing is just strange. It doesn't quite work. I think it could work. There are things there that do work, but as a whole, as 6 episodes, it doesn't. And I think that the main problem is, as we've sort of said, the length. I'm not going to talk about padding anymore because it'll feel like we're padding out this episode by just talking about padding. But it's something that this season is just so unbelievably guilty of, and it hasn't really been a problem until this point. We've mentioned that stories have padding and that there's a lot of capture escape, and that kind of thing. But this whole season really does seem to struggle with it, and it's quite odd. And I don't want to end on a downer. There's a lot to enjoy in season 9. It is John Pertwee and Katie Manning at sort of the height of the powers. The Master is excellent as he was in the last season. There are some great unit family moments. We've mentioned Day of the Daleks, sort of Joe going to feed Benton and then Yates nicking it, and just things like that. There's so much to enjoy in it. The team does feel like a family. There is this real sort of sense of, now that Doctor Who has a wider cast, now it isn't just the Doctor and his companion, and we've got the Master and all of these military characters. It just all feels as though it's clicked into place here, and it's like I say, it's a shame that the Time Monster is the last time that all of these characters are together. And obviously, part of that is due to some very tragic circumstances. Sadly, Roger Delgado was only able to do one more story before he died. We never got to see the completion of his master's sort of storyline. Whether the whole big epic Doctor versus Master finale in season 12 would have been any good or not is another question, but it definitely feels like that the characters are heading somewhere, and the Master, even though he's only been around for a series, is really well established as the Moriarty to the Doctor's Holmes, which was always the intention. Well, that is all we have time for. As ever, it has been absolutely great discussing a season of Doctor Who with you both. I'm looking forward to us doing season 10. I think there's a lot more in season 10 to enjoy than there is in season 9. But like I say, it is still a good season. There isn't a bad season of Doctor Who, I don't think. Everything sort of has its merits. But we'll leave it there on that note. So I will say a big thank you and goodbye to Jimmy.
See you next time.
And a thank you and goodbye to Greg.
A pleasure as always.
And we will be back for more podcasting in the not too distant future. Goodbye now.